Imagine sitting alone in a small cafe. Copyright in Edinburgh. Outside, the Scottish sky is grey. Rain moves slowly across the windows. Inside, a young mother watches her baby sleep in a pram beside her. She has very little money. Her marriage has ended. Her career has not yet begun. The future is uncertain, but inside her mind is a boy with round glasses, a lightning-shaped scar, a mysterious past, and a letter that will one day change the world. That woman is Joanne Rowling. Years later, millions of children and adults will know her simply as J.K. Rowling. Her creation, Harry Potter, will become one of the most successful literary franchises in history, with the book selling more than 600 million copies worldwide and being translated into 85 languages. But the extraordinary part of her story is not what happened after Harry Potter became famous. It is what happened before, because before Hogwarts, there was uncertainty. Before the millions of books, there were rejection letters, and before the fame, there was a woman trying to build a future while carrying a manuscript in a suitcase. This is the remarkable story of J.K. Rowling, a story about imagination, failure, persistence, and the strange moment when an idea inside one person's mind becomes a story shared by the entire world. To understand Rowling's journey, we have to return to Britain in the 1960s. Joanne Rowling was born on July 31, 1965, in Yate, Gloucestershire, England. Her family later moved to Touch Hill, near Chepstow, where she spent much of her childhood. Her parents loved books, and reading became an important part of her early life. She was, by her own description, a bookish child. While other children might have been outside playing, Rowling often disappeared into stories, and very early, she began creating stories of her own. At 6 years old, she wrote a story about a rabbit. By 11, she had written another story involving 7 cursed diamonds. These early efforts were simple, they were not masterpieces, but they revealed something important. The desire to tell stories was already there, long before Harry Potter existed. Rowling was learning the most important lesson a writer can learn. If you want to become a storyteller, you have to begin by telling stories. She eventually studied French and classics at the University of Exeter. Her knowledge of languages and ancient cultures would later influence the strange names, spells, creatures and traditions of the wizarding world. Some of the spells in Harry Potter were inspired by Latin, but university did not immediately lead to literary success. After graduation, Rowling worked in different jobs and eventually became an English teacher in Portugal. Her life was moving forward, but she still carried an old dream. She wanted to write. Then came a train journey. In 1990, Rowling was traveling from Manchester toward London when her train was delayed. There was nothing particularly magical about the moment. No thunder, no mysterious stranger, no ancient prophecy, just a delayed train. But while she waited, an idea appeared. A boy, a wizard, a school of magic, and an entire world hidden beside the ordinary one. Rowling later described the experience as a sudden arrival of Harry Potter into her imagination. The idea was so powerful that she began building the story in her mind. Over the next several years, the 7-book story began taking shape. She plotted the series carefully, creating characters, relationships, mysteries and future events long before readers would ever encounter them, and this is where the story becomes particularly fascinating. Harry Potter was not simply an idea for one children's book, it was a world with history, a school, families, languages, sports, myths, dark forces, friendships, and rules. Rowling was constructing an imaginary civilization, and like an archaeologist uncovering an ancient city, she began laying its foundations piece by piece. But while Harry Potter was growing in her imagination, Rowling's real life became increasingly difficult. During the years in which she was developing the first novel, her mother died. Rowling later moved to Portugal, where she taught English as a foreign language. She married Jorge Arantz in 1992. In 1993, her daughter Jessica was born, but the marriage ended later that year. Rowling returned to Britain with her young daughter. She also carried something else with her, 3 chapters of Harry Potter. They were inside a suitcase. The image is almost cinematic. A young mother, a child, a suitcase, And inside that suitcase, the beginning of a story that had not yet found a publisher. Rowling settled in Edinburgh, where her sister lived. She trained as a teacher and eventually taught in the city, and whenever she had a spare moment, she wrote. Sometimes she wrote in copyright test while her daughter slept in a pram. The world around her continued moving. People drank coffee, buses passed outside, rain fell on the streets, and at a table somewhere in Edinburgh, Harry Potter was slowly coming to life. This period of Rowling's life is often simplified into a fairy tale. The poor writer becomes rich, the unknown woman becomes famous, the rejected manuscript becomes a bestseller. But real life is rarely that simple. Rowling has spoken publicly about experiencing financial hardship during this period. She was a single mother trying to build a life while pursuing an uncertain dream. There was no guarantee that Harry Potter would ever be published. There was no guarantee that anyone would care, and there was certainly no guarantee that the book would make her wealthy. That uncertainty is important, because persistence is easy to admire after success. It is much harder to understand when you are living through failure, when the future is invisible, when every rejection feels like confirmation that perhaps your dream was unrealistic. Yet Rowling continued, she wrote, she revised, she kept going. Eventually, the manuscript was finished, and then came another difficult stage, finding a publisher. Rowling sent the first chapters of her manuscript to literary agents. One agent responded and asked to see the rest. She later described that letter as one of the best letters she had ever received. But even then, success did not arrive immediately. The manuscript faced rejection. According to Rowling's own account, it took about a year for her agent, Christopher Little, to find a publisher. Eventually, Bloomsbury accepted the book. The title was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and in June 1997, the book was published in Britain under the name J.K. Rowling. The first edition was modest. Bloomsbury's activity material notes that the initial hardback print run was only 500 copies. 500. Today, that number sounds almost unbelievable, because the story that began with those copies would eventually reach hundreds of millions of readers. At first, Harry Potter was simply a new children's fantasy novel, but something happened. Readers connected with it. They recognized themselves in the characters. Harry was lonely. Hermione was intelligent but sometimes underestimated. Ron was funny, insecure and fiercely loyal. Together, they felt real, and Hogwarts felt real too. Perhaps that was the secret. The magic was extraordinary, but the emotions were ordinary. Friendship, fear, jealousy, courage, grief, the desire to belong, the fear of losing someone you love, the hope that somewhere in the world, there is a place where you truly fit. These are not magical experiences, they are human ones, and perhaps that is why the magic worked. The first book became a bestseller, then came Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, then The Prisoner of Azkaban, then The Goblet of Fire. The audience grew, and Harry Potter moved beyond Britain. The books traveled across Europe, across North America, across Asia, across the world. The story was no longer only Rowling's, it belonged to readers. One of the most remarkable aspects of Rowling's writing is how much planning existed behind the books. She knew from early on that the story would consist of 7 novels. She created a long-term narrative in which small details introduced in earlier books could become important much later. This created the feeling that the world existed beyond the pages. There were also linguistic influences hidden throughout the books. Rowling's study of classics helped her create names and spells with echoes of Latin and ancient languages. Even the name Voldemort carries a connection to French, commonly associated with the idea of flight from death. Bloomsbury's educational material also notes that the Hogwarts motto is written in Latin, and there was another clever decision. The author did not publish under the name Joanne Rowling. She used J.K. Rowling. The K was taken from Kathleen, her grandmother's name. The choice helped create the now famous initials that millions of readers would eventually recognize. As Harry Potter grew, stories began to form around its creation. Some were true, others became exaggerated through repetition. One popular image is that Rowling wrote the entire first book in a single copyright while living in poverty. The reality was more complicated. She wrote in cafe tilde copyright test during her time in Edinburgh, often while caring for her daughter, but the novel had been developing for years before that. Another common idea is that Rowling suddenly became successful the moment she finished the manuscript. Again, reality was slower. There were agents, rejections, waiting, editing, publishing decisions, and uncertainty. The real story is actually more inspiring than the myth, because it shows that transformation rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens through hundreds of small decisions. Write another page, send another letter, try again, keep going. There is no scientific evidence for real-world magic, Hogwarts, spells or magical creatures, but there is something scientifically interesting about the phenomenon Rowling created. Stories can influence how people imagine themselves and the world around them. Reading requires the brain to construct places, faces, voices and emotions from words. A sentence on a page can become a castle inside the mind. A few paragraphs can make an imaginary character feel like an old friend. Harry Potter demonstrated the enormous cultural power of sustained storytelling. The books encouraged generations of young readers to spend long periods with complex narratives. And perhaps the deeper discovery is not about magic at all. It is about imagination. Human beings can create entire worlds using nothing more than language. Unlike ancient civilizations, Harry Potter leaves behind no archaeological evidence of a real magical society. There are no archaeological remains of Hogwarts, no ancient wizarding artifacts have been discovered and scientifically verified, and there is no historical evidence that witches and wizards lived secretly alongside ordinary people in the way the novels describe. But there is another kind of evidence. The physical history of the books themselves, original manuscripts, publisher archives, early editions, handwritten notes, printed books, and libraries filled with translations. These objects document something real, the birth and global expansion of a modern literary phenomenon. In that sense, future historians may study Harry Potter in much the same way cultural historians study other major works of literature, not as evidence of magic, but as evidence of what people believed, imagined and loved at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries. So why did Harry Potter become so successful? There are many theories. One is timing. The first book appeared in 1997, at a moment when children's literature was finding new commercial and cultural energy. Another explanation is the structure. The books grew with their readers. The early stories were relatively playful, but as Harry grew older, the subjects became darker, death became more important, choices became more complicated, good and evil became less simple, and the characters matured alongside the audience. There is also the question of belonging. Harry begins the story believing he is ordinary, then he discovers that he belongs somewhere else. That idea can be incredibly powerful for a child. The possibility that there is more to you than the world currently sees. The possibility that your circumstances do not define your future, and perhaps this connects directly to Rowling's own journey. Before the world knew her name, she too was an ordinary person with an extraordinary story still waiting to be discovered. Yet one mystery remains. Where did Harry Potter truly come from? Rowling has described the train journey where the central idea first arrived. But ideas are rarely born from a single moment. They are usually assembled from thousands of experiences, books read during childhood, people encountered along the way, places visited, languages studied, personal fears, losses, dreams, memories, the lonely child, the devoted reader, the student of classics, the teacher, the mother, the woman rebuilding her life. All of these versions of Rowling may have contributed something to the world of Harry Potter, and perhaps that is the real mystery. We often imagine creativity as lightning, one brilliant flash, but creativity may be more like archaeology, layer by layer. Experience is buried inside us, then one day, something uncovers it, and suddenly, a world appears. By 2007, 10 years after the first book was published, the 7-book Harry Potter series was complete. The final novel, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, closed the main story, but the world did not disappear. The books continued to be read, the characters moved on to cinema screens, the stories entered classrooms and libraries. Harry Potter became part of popular culture, The series eventually sold more than 600 million copies and was translated into 85 languages. 8 major films followed. Rowling herself went on to write other works, including novels under the name Robert Galbraith, children's stories and additional works connected to the wizarding world. She also became involved in charitable work, including the children's organization Lumos. But perhaps the most important part of her story happened before any of that. It happened when nobody knew her name, when the manuscript was unfinished, when the future was uncertain, when rejection was possible, when success seemed impossibly far away. A young mother sat in Cafe Tilde copyright S. Her daughter slept nearby, and she wrote, page after page, chapter after chapter. She did not know that millions of people would one day read those words. She did not know that children would dress as her characters. She did not know that the names Hogwarts, Hermione, Dumbledore and Harry Potter would become part of global culture. She only knew that she had a story to tell, and she kept telling it. That may be the greatest lesson in the entire journey. Success does not always begin with confidence. Sometimes it begins with uncertainty. Sometimes the person who changes the world does not feel powerful at all. Sometimes they are simply trying to survive, holding on to an idea that refuses to disappear. J.K. Rowling's journey from financial struggle to literary fame is therefore not really a story about becoming rich. It is a story about continuing, about believing that failure is not necessarily the end of the story, and about understanding that the circumstances surrounding you today may not be the circumstances that define you tomorrow. The woman sitting in an Edinburgh cafe tilde copyright could not see the future, but she could see Harry, and perhaps that was enough, because every great journey begins somewhere, not necessarily in a palace, not necessarily with wealth, not necessarily with certainty. Sometimes it begins with a blank page, a quiet room, a difficult life, and one impossible idea, and somewhere between the first sentence and the final chapter, that impossible idea can become a world that millions of people carry with them, long after they close the book, long after the story ends. And perhaps that is the true magic of J.K. Rowling's story, not that she created a world where magic exists, but that she reminded the real world of something equally powerful. Imagination can change the life of the person who dares to use it.